Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you this evening, and I appreciate very much your coming out on a cold and rainy night to think about some of life's most important questions, including the question before us this evening: can we be good without God? Now, at first, the answer to this question might seem so obvious that even to ask it is apt to make people angry. For while those of us who are Christians undoubtedly find in God a source of moral strength that enables us to lead lives that are better than those that we would have led without Him, certainly it would be arrogant and ignorant to claim that unbelievers do not also often lead good moral lives. In fact, sometimes lives that put ours to shame. But wait. That wasn't the question. It would indeed be arrogant and ignorant to claim that people cannot be good without belief in God. But that wasn't the question. The question was, can we be good without God? And when we ask that question, we're posing in a provocative way a question about the nature of moral values. Are the values that we hold dear and guide our lives by just social conventions akin to driving on the right hand versus the left hand side of the road? Or are they merely expressions of personal preference, like having a taste for certain foods or not? Or are they somehow valid and binding, independent of our opinion? And if they are objective in this way, what is their foundation? Moreover, if morality is just a human convention, then why should we act morally, especially when it conflicts with self-interest? Or are we held accountable in some way for our moral decisions and actions? Well, tonight I want to argue that if God exists, then the objectivity of moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability is secured. But that in the absence of God, that is to say, if God does not exist, then morality is just a human convention. That is to say, morality is wholly subjective and non-binding. We might act in precisely the same ways that we do in fact act, but in the absence of God, such actions would no longer count as good or evil. Since if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Thus, we cannot truly be good without God. On the other hand, if we do believe that objective moral values and duties exist, then that provides objective moral grounds for believing in God. Consider then first the view that God exists. First, if God exists, then objective moral values exist. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, to say that there are objective values is to say that something is good or bad independent of whatever anybody thinks about it. Similarly, to say that we have objective moral duties is to say that certain actions are right or wrong regardless of what we think about it. For example, to say that the Holocaust was objectively wrong is to say that it was wrong even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was right. And it would still have been wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them so that everybody thought the Holocaust was right. On the theistic view, God is the basis for objective moral values. God's own holy and perfectly good nature supplies the absolute standard against which right and wrong are measured. God's moral nature is what Plato called the good. He is the locus and the source of moral value. He is by nature loving, just, kind, faithful, generous, and so forth. Moreover, God's moral nature is expressed in relation to us in the form of divine commands, which constitute our moral duties, or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, these commands flow necessarily from his moral nature. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the whole moral duty of man can be summed up in the two great commandments. First, you shall love the Lord your God with all your strength, and with all your soul, and with all your heart, and with all your mind. And second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective goodness and rightness of love, generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, and condemn as objectively evil and wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression. Finally, on the theistic view, God holds all persons morally accountable for their actions. Evil and wrong will be punished. Righteousness will be vindicated. Good ultimately triumphs over evil. And in the end, we shall see that we do live in a moral universe after all. Despite the inequities of this present life, in the end, the scales of God's justice will be balanced. And thus, the moral choices that we make in this life are infused with an eternal significance. We can, with consistency, make moral choices that actually go contrary to our self-interest, and even undertake acts of extreme self-sacrifice, knowing that such decisions are not ultimately empty and meaningless gestures. Rather, our moral lives have a paramount significance. So I think it's evident that theism provides a sound foundation for morality. Contrast this now with the atheistic worldview. First, if atheism is true, then objective moral values do not exist. If God does not exist, then what is the foundation for objective moral values? More particularly, what is the basis for the objective value of human beings? The most popular form of atheism is naturalism, which holds that the only things that exist are the things postulated by our best scientific theories. But since science is immoral, or rather amoral, you cannot discover moral values through a test tube or through a microscope. It follows immediately then that on naturalism, moral values don't really exist. They're just illusions of human beings. And in any case, that point aside, if God does not exist, then it's difficult to see any reason on atheism to think that human beings are special or that their morality is objectively true. Michael Roos, who is a philosopher of science at the University of Florida, writes as follows. He says, "The position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is just a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." On a naturalistic view, then, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative behavior and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined this to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, exhibit similar behavior for the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has emerged among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality, which is useful in the perpetuation of our species in the struggle for survival. But there doesn't seem to be anything about Homo sapiens that makes this morality objectively true. To think that human beings are special is to succumb to the temptation to speciesism. That is to say, an unjustified bias toward one's own species. Second, now consider moral duties. On the atheistic view, there is no divine lawgiver. But then what source is there for moral obligation? Why think that we have any obligation to do anything? Who or what imposes such duties upon us? On the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations toward one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it does not murder the zebra. Or when a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it does not rape her, for none of these things are forbidden. There is no moral dimension to these actions. They are neither prohibited nor obligatory. So, if God does not exist, what is the source of moral obligation? Where do moral duties come from? It's hard to see why they would be anything more than just a subjective impression resulting from societal and parental conditioning. Certain actions, such as incest and rape, for example, may not be biologically and socially advantageous. And so, in the course of human evolution, they have become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to show that rape or incest is really wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom. On the atheistic view, the rapist who goes against the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably, like the man who belches loudly at the dinner table. If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law which we must obey. Richard Taylor, who is an eminent American ethicist, writes as follows: "The modern age," he says, "more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. Thus, even educated persons sometimes declare that such things as war or abortion or the violation of certain human rights are morally wrong, and they imagine that they have said something true and significant. Educated people do not need to be told, however, that questions such as these have never been answered outside of religion." Taylor concludes, "Contemporary writers in ethics who blithely discourse upon moral right and wrong and moral obligation without any reference to religion are really just weaving intellectual webs in thin air, which amounts to saying that they discourse without meaning." Now, it's very important that we remain clear in our understanding of the issue before us. The question is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? There's no reason to think that atheists and theists alike may not live what we normally characterize as good and decent lives. Similarly, the question is not, can we formulate a system of ethics without reference to God? If the non-theist grants that human beings do have objective intrinsic value, then there's no reason to think that he can't work out a system of ethics with which the theist would largely be in agreement. Or again, the question is not, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? The theist will typically maintain that a person doesn't need to believe in God in order to recognize, say, that we should love our children. Rather, as the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz puts it, the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation, that is, their foundation in reality. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground, Are they purely ephemeral?